think people are particularly interesting when they don't speak directly about themselves, but about something they care about. And I try to give them a structure within which to do that. So each of the guests on the show speaks about three things: a person, a place, and a thing that are meaningful to them. And tonight, I'm so pleased that the man who will be speaking about those three is Colm Tóibín. So, Colm, who's your person?
Elizabeth Bishop, the American poet, or she was actually born in Canada. So, I mean, or she was part Canadian. She was born in 1911. She died in 1979. She was from a very strange background where her father, who died when she was 6 months old, came from a very rich family in Boston, but her mother came from a small village in Nova Scotia. And her mother was incarcerated in a mental hospital when Bishop was 5, and she was an only child, and she was really brought up by aunts, by people who didn't really, in certain ways, want her. And she thought of herself as a very lonely individual. She had a trust fund. She wandered. She went first to New York. I mean, she studied at Vassar, went to New York, went down to Florida, and then, rather wonderfully, arrived in Brazil in her early 40s and fell in love with a woman in Brazil. And they had some wonderful years together, which are recorded in the letters Bishop wrote from Brazil, just describing the beauty of the place and the amount of fun she had. Fun was a funny word for her. She uses the word fun in her elegy for Robert Lowell, who was a great friend of hers, and says, fun, it always seemed to leave you at a loss. And the idea for her of exile and loss and remembering Nova Scotia, even in one of the letters to Lowell, she talks about how beautiful Brazil is and how exotic and what a marvelous time she's having, but then says, I'd give it all just for one glimpse of the fall colours in Nova Scotia. So she longed for Nova Scotia when she was in Brazil. Eventually she came back to Boston. She was a perfectionist. She worked on some poems for more than 20 years. You can see in a letter the poem being mentioned, and then you realise, oh my God, she isn't finished this poem yet. And while all her male contemporaries were writing, such as Robert Lowell or John Berryman, untidy sequences, she was just getting everything perfect. And she left a great number of drafts of poems or unfinished poems or poems that didn't satisfy her, which she didn't publish in her lifetime. And she also did, something quite strange, which was that she never wrote about what happened to her mother. Even though her mother lived on into the 1930s, she didn't die until Bishop was in her 20s, but she never saw her again after the age of 5. But she never wrote about it, except in one short story, which the New Yorker published, but it's not in the poems. And she didn't put in anything about her father or being an orphan. It's all missing in the poems. It's in a few prose pieces. So what you get is a huge withholding, an austerity, the holding back of emotion. In the poems, she often describes something very, very carefully and then leaves it. So somehow or other you get something in the rhythms of the description which suggests a great melancholy, but it doesn't actually name the sadness. It merely implies it. And so she's an exemplary figure for me in the way she managed to sort of weave in how she felt or what her experience had been without making the weave too obvious or too colourful or too open. So that she was playing a game all the time between disclosure and concealment in the poems. And that makes her a very interesting figure.
And is that a quality that you strive for explicitly and consciously when you write prose?
No, because if you start doing anything explicit or conscious, you lose it. In other words, it has to come from somewhere hidden from you. We all have a style, we all have an aura. People in their own speech patterns. But even if you get a letter or nowadays an email from somebody, the tone will somehow give them away. You know who it's by. And somehow or other, if you're writing a novel, if you decide on a style, say this is my style, it won't work. It has to come first, almost unbidden. And it's an expression of something within you that may remain mysterious to you.
Well, I've heard many actors who say they don't like to read the reviews, and at first you think, "Oh, you're such a liar." But it turned the part that impressed me is the people that said not just that they don't like to read bad reviews because they're quite wounding. I mean, I remember every unkind thing anyone has ever written about me, and if I see any of them in the room, I'll wreak a terrible revenge.
Okay.
But it turned out that what many actors have said is they don't like reading good reviews because it makes them self-conscious. And if someone said, "Oh, I really admire the way you handled that scene," then the next night when they do it, they're aware of the things. Do you think that's how does a writer protect himself from that?
I think there's a difference between acting and writing, which is when a book is finished, it's really not yours anymore. It belongs to the reader. It's written for the reader. So once it's finished, even people are reviewing something that's by that time oddly remote from you. I mean, it isn't as though you have to go on tomorrow night and do the novel again. The novel is over. So really, I don't think a review... there was one review where someone reviewed my second novel and said I had written a diptych with the first novel and the second novel. I thought it was a very grand thing, a diptych. I thought I'd just written 2 novels. So I loved the fact that I'd written a diptych, and I went around telling everybody I've written a diptych. It sounded marvellous, whatever it was, a diptych.
But the novel may be finished, but you're not finished, and you're the same person with the same sensibility. And as you become conscious of it, can your style remain unconscious, just something you do? How can you not be aware of it?
I think it's that you work always on the next sentence. I mean, writing novels especially is a slow process where you write one sentence, you follow with another, you concentrate on the sentences, and the most important thing is that the page, I mean, I write in longhand, but it doesn't matter, it could be a screen. It's not a mirror, it's blank. And so that you're not looking at yourself in it. And what you must do, I think, if you're writing fiction, is a sort of self-suppression or self-annihilation, that you don't exist, but the character exists and the sentences exist. So I think you must stop thinking about yourself. That's the first thing you must do when you're writing. And you must look outwards rather than inwards.
Bishop wrote only, I think the number I saw is 101 poems. Yeah, is that close?
Yeah.
Do you think she knew, as she was writing, I'm only going to write a very small number of poems, and that affected the way she wrote?
Oh, no, you see, part of the problem was that she was alcoholic. So she was always drinking. And there's really a decade in Florida, in Key West, where you realize there are very few poems from this decade, and you look up what she was doing. Well, she was fishing, she was drinking, she was having a good time within her own limits. She wasn't particularly skilled at having a good time. But I think she did become conscious of her position within poetry, that she became oddly ambitious, and that she really, I mean, she was often being referred to as a sort of lace-making poet, as someone who was good on whimsy, on noticing very small things. And I think throughout her career, she began to resent this and realize that if she stuck to it, if she just kept describing things very carefully and slowly, that something would emerge in the poetry that was much greater than the poem's own occasion. And I think she did know that, and she did strive towards it.
When this kind of lace-making poet, is that condescending, and is it misogynist?
Oh, it was misogynistic. It was just all these guys were trying to write the great American poem, the great sequence, the 1,000 sonnets. And she was writing one sonnet. It took her ages. And it's a skinny little sonnet. And I think she was rather proud of the fact that it's a perfect sonnet, whereas Robert Lowell's sonnets were, I suppose, very grand, but oddly imperfect.
Because he was a volume operation. We can make more. But she, I think, would refuse to be published in women's anthologies, yes?
Yeah, I mean, she was a lesbian, but she said closets, closets, and more closets. She didn't want to be part of that movement. And she didn't want to be in a ladies' anthology, no anthology of women-only poetry. She really wanted to compete with the best.
Right.
And was stubborn, steadfast, serious, and slow. And she realized that the business of producing a work that is abiding, in other words, not following fashion, trying to follow something strange within yourself. And in her case, she was a great noticer of the smallest thing. And she was always correcting herself to make sure that detail was absolutely right. Detail of landscape, or detail of how someone spoke, or what exactly happened. This is her mode, and she manages somehow or other, despite the fact that she limited herself, she managed to write poetry which I think has a sort of grandeur about it, moves way beyond the limits that she set. So she's a very interesting figure in that way. There's a sort of enormous modesty and melancholy in her tone in the poems. Like she describes, she's walking on a beach and she sees a house, and you know, it's a beautiful sort of clapboard house on a beach, and she thinks, I'd love to retire and do nothing. And then she immediately corrects herself, or nothing much, in 2 bare rooms. And I love that, the distinction between nothing, and you can see her mind working, nothing, or nothing much in 2 bare rooms. She was best also, it's an interesting thing, I think writers find loss interesting, useful, and nourishing. For example, if the house you were brought up in is lived in by other people, or someone bulldozes it, you become the only person who can describe and remember the life that was lived in that house. You become a sort of repository of certain sorts of memory. And you can also imagine characters in those houses. So Bishop was very good. I mean, I think her best Brazilian poem is a poem she wrote many years later when she'd lost Brazil. And her Nova Scotia poems, the best ones, are the ones she wrote in Brazil, where she'd lost Nova Scotia.
I don't mean to be too psychological about it, because it sounds very reductive, but she did start out with a life of just ferocious loss as a child. I mean, the death of her father, her mother in the asylum.
Yeah, and it gets worse because when she was... No, it really does, because when she was 8... her father's family came to snatch her or fetch her. In other words, she was Great Village in Nova Scotia. It's called Great Village because it's so small, and she was being brought up there almost wild. I mean, she was in bare feet outside, and the bishops came and saw her and said, "Our grandchild cannot be brought up like this." They snatched her and brought her to Boston. Eczema, asthma, all those illnesses that one associates with disturbance or with all of them occurred to her, and she really was the most miserable child living in this posh house in Boston. So eventually she was taken by another aunt and brought up in Worcester in Massachusetts. And she's a great description of the aunt in a poem called In the Waiting Room, which is about listening to her aunt in the dentist's. She's outside in the waiting room, and she suddenly hears her aunt going, "Oh!" Something happens in the waiting room, in the dentist's office. And the child, in that second, realizes that extraordinary thing we all have to realize at some point in our childhood, that we are a person. We are a full person. We're different from everybody else. We're only ourselves. And she describes this very wonderfully in that poem. But things did get worse, several times, because her lover, who was a wonderful architect and designer of gardens in Brazil from a very aristocratic family, and she sounded like a marvelous character, but she did commit suicide, and she committed suicide in New York with Bishop in the house. So she lost her as well, and that was really miserable.
So it's a life of constant loss, written about brilliantly. I think if we had to make a list of writers who write about loss and sadness, it would be a more impressive list than the list of writers who write about happiness.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that I don't think a really happy childhood and so on, has ever helped a novelist or a poet to write better novels or better poems. I mean, I just W.H. Auden put it best when he was asked, how do you make a writer? I said, as much neurosis as the child can take, was his reply.
Would you, before we end the segment, would you read a Bishop poem?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting one. It's one of her most famous poems. It's a villanelle, meaning that it has lines that repeat, like Dylan Thomas's "Do not go gentle into that good night," then repeats with "rage, rage against the dying of the light." And if you just notice in this poem, I mean, she's lost her father, her mother, and her lover of many years. But she doesn't mention them in this poem about losing. She has a new lover now. She's in Boston, and she's worried about losing this lover. But she doesn't mention the great losses. She mentions the small ones. So this is a famous Bishop poem called One Art. The art of losing isn't hard to master. So many things seem filled with the intent to be lost that their loss is no disaster. Lose something every day except the fluster of lost door keys, the hour badly spent. The art of losing isn't hard to master. Then practice losing farther, losing faster, places and names, and where it was you meant to travel, none of these will bring disaster. I lost my mother's watch and looked my last or next to last of 3 loved houses went. The art of losing isn't hard to master. I lost 2 cities, lovely ones, and vaster, some realms I own, 2 rivers, a continent. I missed them, but it wasn't a disaster, even losing you. The joking voice, a gesture I love, I shan't have lied. It's evident the art of losing's not too hard to master, though it may look like, write it, like disaster.
We'll take a minute. We'll be right back. Stephanie Coleman. Colm, where's your place?
The place is called Enniscorthy, and it's in County Wexford in the southeast of Ireland. And it's a town I'm from. 3 of my grandparents were born in the town. And my father was a teacher and my sisters were teachers, so that being teachers in a small town, a town of 6,000 people, I think gives you a real sense of the town. The town is more or less a battlefield. The rebellion of 1798 was in some respects based on the French Revolution and on the American Revolution. There were even people involved, even on both sides, who had been involved in the American Revolution. This is Ireland in 1798, and in County Wexford, the corner county in the southeast, there was a big rebellion in the name of liberty. And of course, the rebellion was crushed and put down. But the beginning and the end of it was in the town of Enniscorthy. So all the ballads have the town actually named. And it was this time of the year in June. And the last battle was fought on the hill called Vinegar Hill. There's a Vinegar Hill in Brooklyn. It's called after our Vinegar Hill in Enniscorthy. And Vinegar Hill overlooks the town. And so the ballad would go at Vinegar Hill or the pleasant Slaney. Our heroes vainly stood back to back. And the Yos at Tullow took Father Murphy and burned his body upon the rack. God grant you glory, brave Father Murphy, and open heaven to all your men. For the cause that called you may call tomorrow in another fight for the green again. And these were the ballads that everybody knew all over Ireland, but they were about my town. And the town is 10 miles from the coast. And because my father was a teacher, we could have long holidays. You could rent a little hut or even a few rooms in somebody's house. And we spent the summers on this stretch of coast. The advantage of a town of 6,000 people to a novelist is great because you know a lot of things about people. My father died when I was 12, and the tradition would be still in place to some extent in the town, where what people would do is they would, depending on how well they knew the family, they would visit immediately or they would wait for a while. But the house for a month or even 2 months was filled with people. And every night new people came. And I was a little 12-year-old novelist, and they should have put me out because I listened to everything everyone said. And often the most interesting things said were when someone had left. And people would start talking about them. And I I remember, I think I remember everything that was said. One of the examples is that the novel Brooklyn that I wrote, actually, that story was told in the house one night. A woman had left, and people started to talk about her daughter who had gone to Brooklyn. And they told the story, and 40 years later, I remembered it, and I wrote a novel based on just a tiny story somebody told in the house on one of those nights. So the town is interesting for that reason, in that, sometimes I would see somebody, I go in, I have a house on the coast, so I would drive in on a Saturday morning, and there's a wonderful farmer's market. You see everybody, but sometimes you see somebody and you realize that could only be the son of so-and-so because of the face. That I know exactly who you are, you could say to somebody, because they have some family trait. And so it's... the other thing in the town, it has a beautiful castle that was built in the last years of Elizabeth's reign, Elizabeth I. And my father and a priest raised money to restore the castle in the late 50s, early 60s, and in order to make a museum of it. And Edmund Spencer had been in the castle, Walter Raleigh had been in the castle, all those great Elizabethan adventurers had been in the castle. And there were huge oak woods going north from the town, and the Elizabethans came, and the one thing they really loved was oak. And they cut down all the trees, and they sent the trees down the river, and they went towards the building of London or the creation of...
or building ships.
Yeah.
Do you use the town as a setting?
I didn't intend to. I really didn't think it was interesting. And so I wrote my first novel. It's set in Barcelona and in the Pyrenees, even though the characters are from Enniscorthy. And when I was coming halfway, one of the problems with a novel is halfway through, you often just get stuck. You think, well, I know the story. What can I do now? And so one day I decided I would close my eyes, and any word that came to me, I would write down. And the word came, it said the sea, a grey shine on the sea. So it wasn't the Mediterranean. It was the Irish Sea. And I suddenly found I'd brought the two characters back to Ireland, back to this coastline in County Wexford. I suddenly found that the rhythms and the way I was managing feeling and the way I was managing structure was better in this chapter than the other chapters. And I realized that this was home. This was the place that I didn't think was big enough or glamorous enough or colourful enough for a novel. So the next novel I wrote, called The Heather Blazing, is almost entirely set in the town. Then I did it again in other novels. And so in this novel that I've just written now, or that's just out in paperback, Nora Webster, it really is more or less the story of my mother in the years after my father died in the town. It's named as Enniscorthy. Some of it's invented, but a lot of it is true down to the smallest detail of what happened. In other words, what happens in a small community when a woman in her 40s is left a widow. How people both irritate her by just watching her too closely or bossing her around too much. Then other people come to guard her, protect her, advise her, look after her. So there's this mixture of things going on in the town that become sort of dramatic in her life. And so, but I didn't have a problem in a way because I knew the town enough, especially in those years, to be able to describe what would happen if she went downtown, who she would meet. And a lot of the people are based on real people. I hope they don't mind, but I did change names and things like that.
But now, it's common to change the names of people, but did you keep the names of the places?
Yeah, that's fundamental for me, that the town is named in those books, in those novels of mine, as Enniscorthy, and the topography is actually true. In other words, if you turn left if you go down Castle Hill and turn right, you will go into Farry Place. If you then turn right again, you'll go to Farry Hill. If you turn left, you'll go to Court Street leading to John Street. I find this a sort of anchor. In other words, that because this part is true, the topography, then maybe the other things, the emotions, or how people speak, or some response somebody has to something, might also be closer to true than it would be if I'd done it in an invented landscape.
But even if you use the same landscape, you could change the name. The same way. My question is then.
No, you couldn't.
People feel. You can't, because people feel compelled to change the names of characters, people based on.
Oh yeah.
But not the names of places. So what's the difference?
The difference,
other than lawsuits, I guess.
No, it's not just that. It is that by setting a fictional world, even though some of it's, as I say, a lot of it is from what happened. Other parts are invented, but it doesn't matter which of those it is, because what you're trying to do is find an arc is tell a story, is make everything convincing, even what was true. You know, if you just write down what happened, sometimes experience is thin, has no shape. What I'm trying to do is shape the experience and give it so that it goes up and then over, which isn't the way life is, but it's the way a novel has to be. By putting down the real names of places, you somehow or other are jogging, or what's the word? You are working with your own memory. You're summoning up emotion just by thinking of that hill, that part of the coast, and by putting its real name in, you're getting something from it that actually leads to further levels of emotion going down, you would hope, as deep as you possibly can.
But of course, different writers take different. Faulkner changed. We know his landscape. You can go to Oxford, Mississippi, and you can see where all the Faulkner stories take place. But the names are changed.
He did that, but for example, the big one who didn't do it was James Joyce.
That all the names are right.
I mean, his Dublin, you know, is there in Ulysses. There's every street name. Even at one point, you know, he would write letters to say, if you jump over those railings, where will you land? So that he would be absolutely precise. And it means when you're walking in Dublin, sometimes you're walking in a landscape that Joyce invented, or at least summoned up for his work. So he was the other one who really did that in Ireland.
Or I grew up in Reading, Pennsylvania, and it's right next to Shillington, where John Updike lived and said a lot of his stories. And the first time I ever saw a place I knew in a book, it was in this John Updike book, The Centaur. Do you remember this one?
Yeah.
And but he's changed all the names, and so a lot of stuff there's named for William Penn. He named it all after Conrad Weiser, a much more minor pioneer. We didn't care about Conrad Weiser, and it was very disturbing seeing it in a book. That there's a scene that takes place on Walnut Street, which is where my father worked, and somehow seeing this in a book, it all seemed, because he's John Updike, shabby and small, and the people were cruel, and all of which I'm sure is absolutely true. But when you see things in a movie, they're always fabulously glamorous. Do you think that distinction generally holds true?
I mean, I think that sometimes writers operate, you know, seeking revenge for slights, real and imagined, done to them in childhood or done to their family. But I don't actually feel that. I mean, so that the town for me is, I suppose, a more placid and stable place. And then I can put characters in and create crises in their lives in a stable place. So I'm working with stability, with images that are deeply unstable as well, so we're working against them.
And then, of course, as a reader, it gives you the chance to walk into the fiction, because you can visit the landscape, and people really like to go to writers' houses. People want to see. Well, this is what I went to see Dr. Johnson's house, you know, and you could. It's where he wrote the dictionary, and you could sit there and you could look out the window and you could see what he saw, and that's very meaningful. And because in fiction, if you keep the names the same, you can somehow, as a reader, inhabit that space. Yeah,
I think an interesting example is Thomas Mann. We were talking about him earlier. That he wrote Dr. Faustus, which is his last sort of big serious novel. It's all about Faust and the devil and classical music and the rise of Hitler. It's all Germanic and it's filled with parody. He wrote it in Pacific Palisades in Los Angeles. The blazing sun, a palm tree outside, in a most beautiful house that a most serious architect had made for him, with verandas and 2 staircases. It was the most un-German place. You wander into it thinking the imagination is a marvelous thing, that it can actually, he probably, just by looking at a bookcase or a painting or looking inwards, he was able to find the Germany that he needed for his book. And he didn't see California at all. He didn't write about California ever, even though he spent those 13 years in California.
I think once we've got to Thomas Mann, we're not going to get any better as an ending for that. So we'll take 1 minute and we'll be right back. Stephanie Coleman. So, Colm, what's your thing?
I chose the CD because I think the great thing that happened, if you think about it from the perspective of the 19th century, was the recording of music, was the way in which all that wonderful tradition could be in everyone's house. And I was old enough to be there for the end of the LP, for the end of vinyl. And I really regretted, losing the vinyl. But records got scratched, and this lovely little silver disc arrived. And it became part of my life where, no matter where I would go, I would look for the CD shop. And New York had wonderful ones, but so did everywhere else. There was an amazing one in Barcelona where the guys working there really knew their classical music inside out. So if you brought up a thing, they'd say, there's a better recording of that. Have you heard of that? And they lived classical music. And so, everywhere I went, I would bring something home. And that idea of music, I mean, it's in Nora Webster as well, where it happened with my mother. This was with vinyl, where after my father died, she wanted to go out once a week, and this was about a year after he died, just to go somewhere, just out of the house. And a friend brought her to the Gramophone Society in the town. And I think most of the people, or everybody in that Gramophone Society has passed on because, well, I hope they don't mind in heaven if they're listening to me, because, of course, each person had a story. She would come home and tell us, there's a woman who conducts all the time. If you put on, what happened was you would bring a stereo record player into a room of a hotel, and people would sit around in a ring and listen to the music, and one person every week would choose the music. And it was like a book group, except with music, because records were really expensive in those years. And one woman used to conduct. If you put on some orchestra, she'd pretend she was Herbert von Karajan. It would drive my mother nuts. And there was a priest, and he was a very good man. And also, he really loved sopranos, and he talked about them as though he knew them. So he would say, oh, isn't Joan wonderful? I admire Joan enormously. And he'd mean Joan Sutherland. Or he'd say, there's nobody like Kathleen. I always think Kathleen of all of them is the best. And he'd mean Kathleen Ferrier. And so I put all this into the book, but what happened in this small town, 6,000 people, was that classical music lifted people out of themselves. It gave them something so beautiful in their lives that came via vinyl then, but then in my life, having the CDs. But now, I'm 60 this year, and there was someone in my apartment the other day who saw all the CDs, just a pile of CDs beside the stereo, and said, do you listen to CDs? Obviously, you're meant to listen to Spotify or have music on your computer. It's not the same as putting the disc in. The lovely business of pressing the button, the thing coming out the slot, you put the CD in, press it again, it goes right in, and then you press play, and then magic happens. And I think we're all going to be dinosaurs. I mean, people with CDs are going to go around looking for CD players in the future. People say there are not any. You're going to have to go on eBay or on those funny things looking for a CD player. I mean, recently in New York, I had to go because I just needed a small, cheap stereo. God, trying to find somewhere to buy one of those. I mean, I had ready money. I could pay cash. But just asking, is there anywhere in the city where I can buy an ordinary stereo? No, I don't want a computer. I want two speakers and the little machine I can put the silver disc into. So it's made such a difference to my life and to so many other people's lives, that idea of just at night putting in the music and listening to it. And you get something. I remember when the Berlin Wall came down, I was in Berlin after that, but the wall was still up officially in the sense that you could still buy things really cheaply in East Berlin. The only problem was there was nothing you wanted, because everything consumers wanted was in West Berlin, except, of course, CDs. And I remember, I still have it and listen to it still, a version of Brahms' German Requiem that I bought using Ostmark as opposed to Deutschmark. Ostmark were almost worthless, but if you gave them some Ostmark, you could get loads of CDs from the Eastern Bloc, because, of course, the Eastern Bloc still kept that tradition going of classical music.
Right, anachronistic technology. I'm a bit older than you, so For me, it's vinyl.
You don't
I
look
can hear
older
you
than
say
me. I
it
mean,
gets scratchy.
I'm hesitant about this older than me business. I don't think so.
But I'm full of youthful vitality, obviously. But I grew up with vinyl, not with CDs, and that was seen as the beginning of the end of civilization, the shift away from vinyl to CDs. What I miss is what I fear we'll soon miss with books. It's this movement to insubstantiality, which will please all the Buddhists in the room, but depress the heck out of me. That you go into someone's apartment, and as soon as you have a chance to, you look at all their books. I want to see what books are on the shelf, and I flip through their records, or which you can do with CDs.
Yeah.
Well, if it's just something on their iPod, what use is it?
Yes, you can't nose around with the same freedom. W.B. Yeats, the Irish poet, he really wanted to insult members of Dublin City Council, who were all politicians, and he couldn't think of some way to insult them so they could never go out their door again. And he thought of what to say was that these are the sort of people who do not have books in their houses. I thought, oh, wow. Like, what an insult, you know. But there will come a time, and there probably at the moment there are people who have just, it's these Kindle thing. You see them on trains with a funny look on their faces as they sort of press a button and the next page comes. I mean, anyway, I'm too old.
You are. Apparently you are. Because, you know, the book is the book, regardless of the medium, and the music is the music, regardless of the medium, isn't it, in a way? Are we just being sentimental, I guess is what I'm asking.
And no, the fact that in a city, on a Saturday, in any city, you couldn't go for a stroll and then wander into a CD shop. Actually, Germany still has them. And you wander in and see what's new. Oh, will I buy that? No, I'll wait till, you know. And just that business of it being part of a city life. What's happened to our cities now is that all the same stores are in all the same streets. And they just produce a sort of sameness. And so you don't have that experience of strolling and wandering and finding things that matter, such as a CD, you know, on your ordinary Saturday, just wandering.
Into a record shop, and you could strike up a conversation with other people who are standing by the Brahms if you were looking for the Brahms.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's where love stories began, you know, in the Brahms section of CD stores.
Well, yes. So it's not the way you listen to the music at home so much for me. It's the loss of this moment of sociability. I think that's a genuine loss. That's not sentimentality.
Yeah. I know, absolutely agree with you, and it's a pity. But the guy who looked at my CDs, and like he really was aghast that there was someone left in the world who listened to CDs.
As long as you mentioned Nora Webster, would you read a bit from it?
Yeah, I'll read a short bit. This is the 1960s, and I was trying to think of something typical of the 60s that would happen in this book, where public life would make its way into her privacy. And I couldn't think of anything for ages, and then I realised the big thing that happened in our town circa 1966 was the arrival of packets of hair dye. And you would call it to a friend. I mean, I'm talking about being 6 or 7, and you'd call to a friend's house, and his mother would come to the door. And, I mean, overnight, like a tree, she would have gone from, you know, from green to gold, or from brown, from grey to copper. And it was a most extraordinary episode in our history. And on Wednesday morning, Nora went downtown and had her hair done, talking to Bernie and the hairdressers about a new system of dyeing hair she'd read about, wondering if it was time she did something about the grey. I wouldn't like it blue, she said. I know what you mean, Bernie replied, and if it was too black, then it would look dyed, and I was never blonde. Everyone in the town knows I was never blonde. Is there a good brown, so it might not look dyed? I could try this one. Bernie showed her a package with a photograph of a woman with curly brown hair that looked natural. Maybe just start off with a small bit, Nora said. The instructions say to use the whole thing, Bernie said. I've used it before. It's very popular. You'd be surprised who has it. Well, try it so, Nora said. Once the dye had been applied, Bernie put a nylon net on her head and left her to flick through some magazines. When she came over to remove the net then later, Bernie told her not to worry or look too closely, as the real change would come only once the dryer and a brush and comb were used. So anyway, the more Bernie worked, the more her hair seemed to look like a wig. She knew that the dye would take time to wash out, but in the mirror she could see how pleased Bernie was with her own work. There would be no point in complaining. Is it not a bit young for me? She asked. I think you look great, Bernie replied. The cut is very fashionable at the moment. Oh, I've never had a fashionable cut before, she said. When it was finished, she knew that anyone who saw her on her way home would think that she had lost her mind, or that she was trying to look like a young woman rather than someone who was recently widowed. It'll take a few days to get used to, Bernie said, but no one has grey hair anymore. Does the dye not look very unnatural? In a few days it will lose that look and people will think you've had it all your life. You look very worried, but I promise you that by the weekend you'll be delighted with it. You can't wash it out, can you? No, but it will fade. And I guarantee that you'll be back here in a month for the same again. I've never known anyone to go back to the grey, but maybe the next time we'll think of putting some highlights in. They're all the rage now as well. Highlights? Oh, I don't think so. Outside, Nora lifted her head high and hoped that all the women in Court Street and John Street would be busy cooking and that none of them would be standing at the door. She prayed that she would meet no one she knew. In her mind, she went through the worst possible encounters, the people who would most deplore the idea that with her husband, 6 months in the grave, she had dyed her hair a colour it had never been before. As she saw Mrs. Hogan from John Street walking towards her, Nora could not tell whether Mrs. Hogan simply did not recognise her or if she wanted to get by her without making any comment. Just as Mrs. Hogan approached her, she seemed almost to jump. Her face quivered and then she stopped. "Well," she said, "that will take some getting used to."
You'll take some questions from the audience.
Sure, of course, yeah.
Before we do, would you join me in thanking Stephanie Coleman and Colm Tóibín?
Every time you introduce a male character, I thought this was going to be her love interest, and she never had one, even though she's a very young woman. Was that a deliberate thing that you thought about?
Yes, I thought a love interest would be too easy a solution. What I wanted to do was to, over 3 or 4 years in the life of somebody who's faced a crisis, just watch the way they're changing imperceptibly, slowly, using anything they can as a crutch. But if she thinks of marrying again, then that becomes the story. I thought it was too easy. And I thought her solitude, the fact that she was growing all the time within her solitude, that she was learning things by being alone, that was actually mattering to her. And I thought it could be ruined really easily by, for example, having a big epiphany, that in one moment her grief is over, she's a new woman. I just thought that would be false. And it was a quieter story I wanted to tell. But it was there as a temptation at a certain point.
I am a widow of a couple of years with 4 grown children, married. And my first question was already answered. But my second question would be, did you think she was a good mother?
Oh, no. I was interested. You see, there's a real problem for a novelist with goodness. It'd be very hard to write a novel about Mother Teresa of Calcutta, because she was so good. I said, well, she got up in the morning, she did good, and then in the afternoon she was good, and then at night she said her prayers and was very good. But if, however, you found that she was traveling, that she was traveling in business class, and she was drinking a cocktail on the plane and flirting with then you just say, well, actually, this is a story. I can now tell a story about Mother Teresa, the time she went on the plane. And so too with the notion of Nora. She's quite bad at certain moments. She's quite self-centered, she's angry, she's disloyal, and then other times she's fiercely loyal and she really loves her children, but especially with her daughters, she's been quite rude and dismissive. And so that, I think what I wanted was to get a sort of complexity within her. There wasn't a simple matter of her being a good mother and a grieving widow. There's something strong in her that resists goodness. And so I wanted to keep the reader worrying, oh my God, what's she going to do now? And she can be very disappointing. But I think I think the basic thing is that if Madame Bovary had not committed adultery, then she really wouldn't be a novel. She'd just, there would just be, like she was a good wife and a good mother, and she just, cleaned up after everybody and never complained. And that's not a novel. The novel is the moment, when someone does something out of character. That's a novel. When someone does something in character, that's not a novel. That's a sermon, or it's a paradigm for how we should live, which novels are not really.
Several reviews of your Nora Webster suggested that you are the older son in many ways. True?
Yes, what happened was that after my father died, myself and my younger brother were there in the house with my mother. And I couldn't make Donal a little writer. I thought that'd be too easy, and people hate little writers anyway. And I thought, I have a friend whose mother, who's a photographer, he's an abstract photographer. And his mother said to me one day about him, you know, he was blurring photographs from the age of about 12. He would take photographs and he could do his own developing. But in the developing process, deliberately, he would blur faces, he'd distort things. And I thought, what an interesting idea that somebody could do that on their own, and all those photography magazines. So I made Donal a sort of version of myself. And I did have, and I still do have, a stammer. I can control it, and I can work my way through it. And I don't often stammer, but if I'm tired, I still can. But when I was 12, 13, no, it started when I was about 8 or 9, and it was really a problem. My name is a particular problem for a stammerer because it's got 2 hard consonants. It's unsayable. If you get a hard consonant like a K sound or a T sound, it's much easier to start sentences with soft sounds. And in a way, writing becomes a sort of relief, because you can't stammer when you're writing. You don't have the problem. You can write the word, and it's there. Whereas for me, it became a big problem over certain words that I just couldn't say. And so I gave all that to Donal as well in the book.
The music that you chose for her awakening to music, was that something your mother had experienced just that way?
Yeah, I chose a particular recording of Beethoven's Archduke Trio with Jacqueline Dupre, Daniel Barenboim, and Pinka Zuckerman, that was in the house and was listened to a great deal. And also sometimes before I wrote, I would put that on and just listen to a bit of it. It's got a wonderful melody that then fades and comes back in again, especially in the opening movement. But yeah, with the Brahms German Requiem, it was something that I have a particular affection for. And I did, in researching the book, I did go and join a choir that were singing the German Requiem. Not that I was any use in the choir, but I did a lot of mumbling and miming and stuff. But I did learn the sort of experience. Yes, I think more or less all the music, including the Schubert song, Andy Music, and Kathleen Ferrier singing it. Yeah, all of that music mattered either to me or to my mother, but it wasn't chosen at random ever. There was no moment where it was chosen at random. I mean, even the songs she learns to sing were important in some way or other.
I just want to thank you for this wonderful book, and I had the pleasure of listening to it being read by Fiona Shaw, and she really recreated for me that whole area of the world and the sound of the language. And it was, I mean, yes, it's new technology and it's another way to appreciate a novel, but I found it most enjoyable.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I got Meryl Streep did the previous book, The Testament of Mary. I was very surprised she agreed to do it because, you know, it's not flashy work. You have to sit in a studio, often doing things over and over. But Fiona Shaw did something special with Nora Webster because she did all the voices. And it's terribly funny, some of it, and then very sad in other bits. But she did a marvelous job at finding a tone for each voice. And it is something that you have to really hand it to her. I mean, the amount of thought and work you have to do to get that right.
Was her behavior with her children, like sort of pulling back, not asking too much, sort of trying to be the opposite of the way her mother was in terms of constantly questioning her?
Yeah, you feel that she's a damaged soul, you know, and that the damage comes from somewhere, and she doesn't understand it. Her sisters are really afraid of her. But at other moments, for example, when Donal went to the boarding school and was really unhappy there, she becomes this intensely loyal figure to him. And when the other son is moved in school from a good class to a bad class, she becomes a tiger mom. But other moments, she's wrapped up in some other thing, and you feel there is some initial damage, which I didn't want to dramatize or go into, just to take that as on board, that she's not someone who was made perfect. She's someone who's filled with imperfection. And I found that a more interesting thing to work with, as I said earlier, you know. That. But yeah, I think you must see her as a sort of damaged soul.
I love the parts where she breaks out. She loses control when one of the teachers puts either you or your brother in a class that is not sufficiently high enough to please her, and she's almost thrown out of school along with your brother. She buys a record player that everybody says she can't afford. She decides she wants to change the house, so she climbs up in a ladder and wallpapers the house and puts herself almost in a hospital, bedridden, almost addicted to pain medication. She flirts with her daughter's boyfriend and buys outrageous clothes. And I loved all of these parts with Nora breaking out. What I want to know is, are any of these things true? Yes, I know about the record player. And if so, which is your favorite?
Oh, the episode with the school was remarkable. I mean, my younger brother got moved from an A class into a B class, and he was incredibly clever. And my mother decided, I mean, I don't know where she saw pickets. I mean, maybe there were a lot of strikes, that she would personally picket the school. And everybody told her she couldn't do this. And I mean, people got really involved in trying to stop her. And I had more fun thinking my mother is going to picket the school. She didn't in the end, because she won. I mean, she won the battle, but she did it. It was such rage, and it was so anarchic in a certain way. I got nothing but pleasure from that particular episode, the episode of the school, because I hated the school, and I thought picketing it would be a really good idea. And in fact, we were talking about names of teachers. There is one teacher that I did name. He's dead now, but I really didn't like him, and I thought it'll be a lesson to teachers worldwide to be better and to be nicer to the students, because I put his name in, and I think it's something quite unpleasant. Oh yeah, Donald says, "I wish he'd drown." Donald says about him, and I enjoyed writing that sentence, even though Donald has stammering. He says, "I wish he'd drown," but it must stop talking like that about a teacher. But I did put his real name in.